Hey church, welcome to the first study for life groups of the year. It's based on the mini-series we started at the beginning of the year, asking the question, is it well? Is it well with your soul? And we want to move from the question to the positive statement. It is well with my soul. Our souls are the inner operating system of our being. And if there's something wrong with them, everything else about us often goes wrong, is out of sorts, and we become ineffective witnesses to the glory of God. This series is designed to help us to win the battle from digital distraction. 90% of us, according to surveys, the first thing we did when we woke up this morning was look at our phones. We are fed with all sorts of information and stuff that is distracting us from doing what matters most, to care for our souls. Greed can make you spiritually sluggish and slow, just like how sort of fat and lethargic we feel if we've been greedy and eaten too much food. And we live in a very greedy city, greedy for all sorts of things. One of the things I would say perhaps greedy most for is money, and not just to have the stuff in our bank accounts, but for what goes with it, the trappings of money, the comfortable lifestyle, the affluent lifestyle, the luxuries of life, that sense of security that money can provide. This is an image of a griffin. And when London Bridge was rebuilt, according to London's biographer Peter Ackroyd, they put two griffins either side of the southern entrance to guard it. They pulled them out of classical mythology, where griffins are historically in mythology known to guard buried treasure and gold mines. They were wanted to guard, to protect the prosperity, wealth of London. And then after mentioning that in his biography, Peter Ackroyd says, the presiding deity over this place, over London, has always been money. That's the atmosphere, that's the culture, the environment that we live in, and it's very difficult not to get sort of sucked in with all of that and to become greedy for stuff, greedy for money, greedy for fame, greedy for position, for career, for relationships, all this sort of stuff we get very greedy for, and it can be so damaging to us. Greed is destructive. To quote Gordon Gekko in the Wall Street Reboot, greed is a weapon of mass destruction. So how do we resist greed and find that inner elusive peace we deep down long for? Well, that's where we need to learn from the Apostle Paul, one of Jesus' best apprentices, who, he says, learned the secret of contentment in a first century letter that he wrote to a church in Philippi. And in these verses, Paul says, I've learned the secret of contentment, and one of the reasons for that, he says, is he can do all things through Christ who strengthens him. Now, this has been a verse that has been so misunderstood and abused over the years, taken out of context. At one end, there's kind of the crazy kind of use of it. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can walk on water, or I can bench press a London bus, that kind of stuff. And then there's the cruel end, where kind of people can use it manipulatively to say, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. You can clean the toilets, you can carry my bags, and so on. That is not the context of what Paul is saying in these verses, as I hope you'll see as you study together. He's saying, whether I have lots or little, I have learned the secret of contentment because I'm in relationship with Jesus Christ. Paul says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at the last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Paul twice says that he learned the secret of contentment. Always important to look for repetition when studying the Bible. That's significant that he learned this. It didn't just happen to him. He didn't just be born with the ability to be content. He learned it through following Jesus. The context that he's writing this is pretty amazing. Paul learned the secret of contentment to the extent that he is writing this letter from a prison. chained to a soldier. He could have been angry and frustrated by his circumstances, but he had learned to trust in the sovereignty of God, God's plan to his life. He knew the goodness of God. He'd found a contentment even from a dark place like prison. You might want to go back and just have a look at passages like chapter 1, where he says the purpose, the value of his imprisonment, or the second last verse, chapter 4, verse 22, that he talks about the impact that his being in prison is having on the whole of Rome and beyond. One of the keys to Paul's contentment is that he never got over his salvation. He lived in it. He spoke about it all the time. He just lived off God's gracious rescue of him. On the Damascus road, he was off to kind of pursue his self-justification kind of life worldview, and God arrests him. He's on his way to kill Christians, to purge them from the Jewish belief system. And God in Jesus Christ speaks to him and says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Now get up, go into the city and be told what to do." He's got this amazing plan, mission for what you're going to do. There are three things that really strike me that are very powerful about this. The first is that Jesus says, "Persecute me." It speaks of the intimacy and the closeness between Jesus and his followers that we can have. That's to us. That you touch a Christian, you are touching God, Jesus Christ himself. That's how close God is to us, and that's the intimacy we're invited into. The next thing is that God knew Saul by name. He calls him by name. God knows each one of us by name. The third thing is that he repeats the name Saul, Saul. Historical, cultural kind of interesting fact for the time that this was actually written is that meant repeating the name like that meant affection and love. So instead of coming to judge and condemn Saul, God comes with grace, with love, with mercy, with invitation, something that Paul could never earn because he was doing the very opposite. And this just blew Saul away, that God would have mercy for him, that there was forgiveness available for him. And this is what he lived in. This is what he lived off. He had Christ. And that for him was everything. Go back, have a look at chapter 3 and just see what he says about his old life. As impressive as that old life was, advancing in Judaism, to him it was rubbish compared to knowing Christ, knowing the pearl of great price, knowing Jesus is everything, and enjoying that love that we cannot be separated from. That is the ultimate source of contentment. And that's why it's so important that we discuss, how do we abide? How do we remain? How do we resist distractions so that we stay in that love? How do we detox ourselves from greed and confess and repent of that so that we can rejoice in the grace and the goodness of God and find contentment and say no to all the destructive forces that are out there in the world and say yes, absolutely, to Jesus?